Example for command line interface is Unix operating system, because you will enter only the commands to interact with the system. The role and the profile of this user also depends on how he interacts with the system. Hello and warm welcome to one and all. It is Dr. Ravikumar YB, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, First Grade College, MYSURU, the Temple of Excellence. In today's class, let me explain about the user interface design methodologies of software engineering. What does this mean, user interface? That is, graphical user interface is the front-end application used to view which user interacts in order to use the software. That means the best example I can consider here is an HTML web page. These HTML web pages are considered as one of the template based application, and whenever you want to enter some login credentials, you will be prompted with username and password. What is that? That is a username and password. That is a graphical user interface. Similarly, if you want to have any one of the software applications, the application written in any of the language needs to be interacted with an appropriate user interface, that is graphical user interface. Suppose if the user wants to enter some data into the system, there must be some interface design principles, that is like this GUI, where it is called username, password, submit, cancel. All these are what? This is a front end wherein I will enter the username, password, something like this. Something like this. After submitting this document at this position, the username entered by the user and the password entered by the user going to be checked and verified with the database. So the application is interacting with the user interface designs. So that is why we call it as an user interface that interacts with software. So the software becomes more popular if its user interface is very attractive and it is very simple to use and responsive in short time and very easy, clear to understand, consistent on all interface screens. These are some of the properties, that means that gives an interesting point to insert the data into the system by the users. If that is the case, we have two types of user interface. One is command line interface and the other one is graphical user interface. Example for command line interface is Unix operating system, because you will enter only the commands to interact with the system. For example, ls is the command we use to find out the list of files. Then we have many other type of options like ls hyphen, with so many options are there. So these are certain commands we enter here in Unix operating systems to interact with the system. So if that is the case, we have a graphical user interface in which almost all of the interpretations are done in the Windows operating system with the help of graphical user interface. The graphical interface provides the simple interactive interface to interact with the system. That means it is very simple, attractive, easy to use. All those are certain properties. Then GUI can be a combination of both hardware and software. Using GUI, user interprets the software. Let me take up one example for this, a combination of both hardware and software. Let me consider that I have a module called GSM module, which is an hardware device. I have a software here and I want to embed this software into the GSM module. Once it is embedded successfully into the hardware module, I must have the commanding options wherein the user will be entering the username, password and the message which needs to be sent from the sender mobile device to the recipient mobile device. Then all those information entered by the user in the graphical user interface is propagated to the hardware device. From hardware device in turn, it is transferred to the mobiles. That is one of the important application that I can consider here to explain about a combination of hardware and software devices used with the GUI, that is graphical user interface. If that is the case, we have software engineering user interface design with the help of this spiral. In this case, user interface design process consists of the first one, very first phase one, that is use task environmental analysis. That is the first phase of this, which is the second phase, user interface design, which is the third phase, implementation, which is the fourth phase, interface validation, whether all of the GUI developed for it are working according to the requirements of a client is checked and verified using the user interface design. Whether there is any exception arising from it, all those things are tested and verified in the final stage, that is in the validation phase. If that is the case, the analysis and design process of a user interface, iterative and can be represented by a spiral model. That is, I represented it in the previous slide. That means analysis of the user interface is iterative and can be represented by a spiral model. That is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. That is this use interface design, implementation and the interface validation. All these are certain types of design process that is carried out in the form of that. If that is the case, what is the meaning of this user interface design? That means the use and task environmental analysis. Let me explain you that. The focus is based on the profile of users who will interact with the system. Suppose if he is an administrator of the system, then the profile of him is different from the customer who wants to use that system. So in such cases, because the administrator who is the one who is administrating all of the details in a system, but in case of the user, external user will be having only the overview of that software system. So in all these cases, the role and the profile of this user also depends on how he interacts with the system. If that is the case, understanding, skill and knowledge, type of users, etc. based on the user's profile, users are made into categories. From each category, requirements are gathered. That means whether he is an admin. Second one, he is a customer, he is an employee. All these are certain profiles or roles that depending upon that role or a profile of a customer, we will give certain privileges to access the software. That is also based upon the graphical interface is connected with it. Then based on the requirements, understand how to develop the interface. Once all the requirements are gathered and detailed analysis is conducted, that is in the first phase. In the analysis part, the task that the user performs to establish the goals of the system are identified, described and elaborated. That means the task, what is the task the user needs to do? Suppose if admin wants to do something, some interaction with the system must be enabled. Suppose if user wants to do that, then user must have some certain privileges to interact with the system. Similarly, if there is any employee will be having certain privileges to access the system. So then obviously according to the role and access privileges, the GUI must be designed and the GUI must be described very well. That is defined in case of phase 1. Moving on to the phase 2, there will be an analysis phase. That is, where will the interface be located physically? And will the user be sitting, standing or performing other tasks unrelated to the interface? That means the task which is not related to the user interface is not at all considered. Then, does the interface hardware accommodate space, light or noise constraints? All these are certain type of constraints which are considered here. That is environmental factors, which includes the operating system which is defined for this. All these are certain types of environments. Second one, in the case of this phase 2 interface design, we have the goal of this phase is to design the set of interface objects and actions. What is the event generated by the user? How the generated events are handled by the event handlers? All those things, tasks are controlled and monitored by the system for validation purpose. If that is the case, indicate how these control mechanisms affect the system. Specify the action sequence of the tasks and subtasks, also called as a scenario, user scenario. In all these cases, what is the sequence? Which event must occur first? Which is the next event that should occur? Which is the third event that should occur? All these process of sequential event occurring process must be done very carefully based upon the system requirements. That means the graphical user interface must be designed according to the requirements of a client. Then indicate the state of the system when the user performs a particular task. Always follow the 3 golden rules strategy proposed by Theo Mandel. What is that? Let me explain about the golden rules in the next session. In today's session, let me explain about the design issues. That is in the phase 2. Design issues such as response time, command and action structure. As I told you that if you submit anything, that is in the submit button, that is in the cancel button, when you submit something here, it has to be presented to the system and the system must respond appropriately in time. That is called as a response time. And the command and action that is taken by the system must also be considered here. Along with it, the error handling. Suppose if the user enters any values like unrelated values and enters some submit or cancel button, it has to be validated specifically by the system. That is called as this. And help facilities are considered as the design model is refined. This phase serves as the foundation for implementation phase. That is for the third phase. This is the foundation for the third phase. That is design strategies. Moving on to the third, interface construction and implementation part, wherein you will be having dragging and dropping the components. And all those components must be defined with certain logic. That is, the implementation activity begins with the creation of prototype model that enables usage scenarios to be evaluated. For example, let me design one of the important application for our Vidhyaashram, so that the Vidhyaashram student who wants to access that application will be able to get access to it through the login credentials. That is, if that is the case, let me define and design an application for accessing the materials required for you. Before you go on reading the materials, you must have some interest to read the subject. So in order to get that, an academic application must be developed. Let me have it for you guys. Now let me concentrate on it here. That is the implementation part. If I design that project or a system which is having the user interface, then the system must be designed according to the requirements of a student, so that the system works according to the requirements of a student. If that is the case, an iterative design process continues a user interface toolkit that allows the creation of windows. That is the dialog windows with all these, that is into mark, minimize and maximize. All these are certain type of operations, and within these windows certain text boxes, labels, buttons, checkbox, and all these must be specified properly here. That is called as menus. That is file menu, edit menu. All these are certain type of operations that are provided with it. Device interaction, error messages, commands. Suppose if any error or exception arises, what type of error message must be displayed to the user? That is the information message, or what is the kind of information going to be designed and developed for the user is used here. So, which is the final phase? That is interface validation. In the case of interface validation, whether the interface generated, designed for the client is working according to the requirement is going to be validated. That is called as the interface validation. In this case, focuses on testing. As I told you now, it is validated. That means testing is performed. The interface should be in such a way that it should be able to perform tasks correctly. And it should be able to handle a variety of tasks. That means if it is able to submit the information to the application, or do you want to cancel the application to be processed. All those are certain type of multiple tasks which needs to be handled carefully by the system. Suppose if that is the case, it should achieve all the user's requirements. That means whatever the requirements specified in the SRS must have been met in this system using the user interface, so that the user will be able to interact with the system very well. So if that is the case, it should be easy to use, easy to learn, and easy to understand. Users should accept the interface as a useful one in their work. This is called as the user interface validation. With this, I am going to conclude this session. Kindly ask me any questions if you have with respect to the user interface design procedures in software engineering. Thank you very much. Thank you one and all.